Hello. I'm talking about Old English today, and I'm talking about the words that aren't from Germanic. I'm talking about loanwords. I'm talking about the effect on Old English culture, early medieval England, of its encounter with other cultures. And I think this is a really interesting subject. I know there are people who really like the idea of early Germanic cultures because they have this fantasy of this non hybrid culture, this pure culture. But this is a fantasy. It has always been a fantasy. Some of the loanwords in Old English go back to before it was even Old English, when it was like West Germanic or even Proto Germanic. For example, the word street, which is in German, it's Strasse. And this is actually related to a Latin word stratum, which was one of the words that was used for a road. It's a layered up brick road. Other words like words for money and market also were adopted into Germanic before it even branched off into Old High Germanic and Dutch and Old English and stuff like that. So the idea that there was a pure, untouched Germanic culture at some point is an ideological fantasy. With that said, let's talk about Old English, the lexicon, and intercultural contact. I just want to talk briefly about this one image here, which is a very interesting one. This is a 12th century Norman church mural, and we're going to talk about the Normans next week when we talk about Middle English, because they were Germanic peoples who settled in the north of France and started speaking French, and then conquered England and brought the French language to England, which had a very, very vast effects, which we will discuss on the English language, which became way more hybrid than it was in the Old English period. But yeah, St. Cuthbert was an Old English saint from the north of England, and he was St. Cuthbert of Lindisfarne, which is a famous monastery that was, in fact, sacked by Viking raiders in 793, kicking off the Viking raid in English. And Cuthbert is one of the earliest Old English Germanic Old English saints from that period, and he was considered sacred to in the north of England, especially. He's kind of a local patron saint. Supposedly fought a dragon, I think. I don't know. I had a roommate in college who wrote her dissertation on St. Cuthbert, and I don't remember much about him. Anyway, the important point is that pretty early on, from the 600s, beginning in the 600s, and well established by the 800s, the Old English people had become Christian, and this had, of course, a pretty strong effect on the language. Let's look at a list of Latin loanwords in Old English. Wow, that sounds like it could be one of those speech exercises that actors do. Let's look at a list of Latin loanwords. In Latin, in Old English, we have the following words that come from Latin: abbot, apostle, candle, chiriche, devil, disciple, bishop, martyr, munuk, which is monk, nunna, which is nun, papa, which is pope, praust, which is priest, temple. Okay, so what do these all have in common? I think that pretty much everyone can work out that these are all words related to religion and to religious practice, and to specifically to Catholic Christianity as practiced in England in the early Middle Ages, when there were no such thing as Protestants at this time. Of course, there were no Lutherans or Baptists. Everyone was more or less a Roman Catholic in the West. Although there were early in the early English period, early in the Old English period, there was some controversy between Catholic Christianity as it had been practiced by Celts, insular Christianity, before the arrival of a Roman Catholic mission, which was founded in Canterbury, in Kent, which was why Canterbury became the head of the Church of England. So there were various differences that had to be worked out. But by the mid 800s, pretty much all of the British Islands were Catholic Christians. And the Old English borrowed a lot of words straight from Latin at this time that have stayed in our language since the Old English period. Let's talk a little bit more about what happened. We talked about the establishment a few videos ago of Germanic peoples in England. But what happens in 793 is that we get another wave of Germanic raiders. This time not from the lower part of the continent, not from Denmark and lower Saxony, the northern Germany, but this time also from Denmark and Norway and Scandinavia, from the Scandinavian peninsula. We get an upsurge in raiders, and they've come down to us in history with the name Viking. What's interesting about the name Viking is that it's not an ethnicity, it's not a people. There were no there were no tribes who were like, we were the Vikings. Viking was an activity, maybe even a profession. To go Viking was to go raiding, and specifically, it referred to taking your boat up rivers in order to raid the, because for 10,000 years, human beings tend to build their settlements near rivers, right? There's transportation, there's fresh water, there's usually other, you can grow crops, other animals come around, you can hunt, gather. Rivers are great. Our human civilization is built around rivers. Unfortunately, rivers can also let Vikings with longboats with very shallow keels come up during the summertime after these people had planted their crops in their own country, go and raid you, take your stuff, burn your thatched roof villages down or your monasteries, and head back to Denmark or Norway or whatever. And this begins in hardcore in 793 with the raid at Lindisfarne. And the raids of Norse people. Oh, one more thing about the word Viking is that the root vik, the stem, weak, is a word for a river or a body of water, which we see in like the words like Dunwich or Warwick or anything with the wick ending. Any place name with the wick ending is that root. So Norse raids intensify through the 800s, and in the 870s, it looks like the Danes might overrun England entirely and take it over completely, except for the fact that a very capable leader named Alfred of Wessex is able to cobble together an alliance of English-speaking people, and wins a decisive victory against the Danes and is able to negotiate a treaty in which Eastern England remains under Danish rule, and Western England remains under the rule of Wessex and Mercia, with Wessex as the kind of local hegemon, the strongest English presence that kind of holds an alliance together. The part that's ruled by the Danes is known as the Danelaw, and London is at the dividing line. And the dividing line actually goes through Reading, up near Leicester and Nottingham, up to where modern day like Liverpool, Manchester area is. And it actually, the dividing line actually follows an old Roman road. But to the east, when you get into East Anglia, and especially when you get up to northeastern England, to modern day Yorkshire, and north of that to where Durham and Newcastle and places like that are, there's still an accent. If you listen to an old Yorkshireman talk, it still sounds it has kind of a sing-song aspect to it that sounds almost like Scandinavian. And there's definitely longer effects. Also in the northeast of England is where you get last names like Johnson and Peterson and Allenson or whatever. Any of those names that have son at the end are people who can probably trace their descent eventually. They can trace the name back to Viking, to Danish, to Norse invaders who used that, what's called a patronymic naming, the patronymic names, which were not used in other parts of England. So the Norse presence remains strongest in the Northeast, and the English um, remains relatively uncontacted, well, relatively untouched by the influence of Danish and Norse in the Southwest. Now, modern Southwest English, and we'll talk about this many weeks from now, but you can think of like the Southwestern English as it's spoken is sounding like that of like Merry and Pippin and Sam in Lord of the Rings. They speak that sort of, oh yes, Mr. Frodo, with the hard R. That's a Southwestern English accent. All right. So a little bit more about Norse. So we talked about the effects of Latin on Old English. Let's talk briefly about Norse and what happened to English because all these Norse speakers were there. There's quite a few Norse speakers. Here, by the way, is a picture of Ragnar Lodbrok, a sort of legendary Viking raider, like chieftain king, who there's a lot of accounts about, but very little is known about him, except that it was his grandsons who ended up becoming regional petty kings in England, and eventually, sorry to say for the big Thor and Odin fans, eventually did become Christian and became proper English people. I'm speaking facetiously, but as to whether Vikings had, as depicted here from the series The Vikings, whether they all had the kind of punk rock industrial undershaves that we used to have in the 90s and which have come back. I don't know whether they did that or if that's made up, just like them wearing horned helmets was made up in the 19th century. Here are some of the words that we have borrowed from the Vikings, or that the Vikings forced on the English, whichever way you want to put it. They, them, their. Wait, what? Those like basic pronouns came from Norse, not from English. Well, yeah, because remember how like the singular was he and the plural was here. Like they're so close together that if you have another alternative available, you can see why they would go for them. It's that principle of ease of understanding, which we talked about in week 1 and 2 when we were talking about principles of language change. Anger. From the word anger, meaning sorrow in Old Norse. The word bag from bagi, bag, bundle. Cake is from kaka, a flat, round loaf of bread. Crook from kroker. Fellow from the Norse compound, felagi, someone who puts down money, a companion, a partner. Flat is from Old Norse. Law is from lagu, which is the plural of lag, that which is laid down. The window we talked about already is from vinder plus aug, wind plus eye. Whole bunch of other words: get, scrape, take, sister, skin, low, odd, ugly. We also get an interesting thing. We get doublets, which is two words that are closely related from the same root. So, for example, the word skirt and the word shirt both come from an older Germanic word for like a tunic type garment, right? Like a kind of roby over thing that you put on, right? And depending on how long as it is and where it stops and where it starts, is it a shirt or a skirt? And this is an example of this. The word skirt comes to us from Norse, and shirt comes to us from Old English. We have similar doublets, like for example, skiff is a kind of boat that comes from Norse. Ship is a cognate word. It's closely related. Comes from the same original word, and that's from OG Old English. All right. So, what about the other language that was spoken on the British Isles? The other major language, which was Brittonic or Brittonic, language in the Celtic family. There is really not many words in old that come into English from Brittonic at all. There have been a lot of theories as to why this is. And there's been a lot of arguments as to whether there wasn't a strong syntactic influence from Brittonic on Old English, which accounts for some of the major differences between Old English and other Germanic languages. There's a lot of scholarship on this subject. It gets pretty technical. It's not necessary for you to learn, but if you're interested, get in touch with me and I'll put you onto some sources. But here are some words that come from Celtic, the Celtic language spoken in southern Britain during the Old English period. Basket, beak. I like this one. Brat, which is originally from a cloak or cloth, a ragged garment. A beggar's child was a brat. The word brock is a badger. Coombe is valley, as in, and a lot of a lot of toponyms, a lot of place names in England actually have Celtic origins. In the same way that in the United States and Canada, a lot of place names have um, names that originally, like Missouri, or that originally come from First Nations, indigenous peoples of this place. Um, Dad and Daddy come from Celtic and Brittonic. The word doe, as in a doe, a deer, a female deer. Flannel, gob, a mouth, a lump, a mouthful, and nook, like a little nook and cranny. All of those are from Old English. And I think it was in the last video that I was talking about semantic narrowing, about how a word that has a broader meaning then has a narrower meaning or a shift in meaning. And I feel like I could go on a whole tangent about daddy right now in that respect, which has had a significant semantic shift in the last few years. But I'm not going to. You can do that project yourself. All right. Have a great week. I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and I hope they're useful to you. And I look forward to getting into the discussion board and talking about the history of the English language with you. Until next time, bye.